So today we're going to start off with substantive due process. Now, the reason for transitioning into substantive due process is because it's absolutely necessary to discuss what substantive due process is, because it's the method by which privacy gets read into the Constitution. And so today I'm going to provide a little bit of background about substantive due process, what it means, how it came into existence, and also how it fell out of fashion. Because substantive due process has sort of a life cycle of itself, and we're going to examine that very briefly today. So we all know that the Due Process Clause arises out of the Fifth and 14th Amendments and applies to the states and respective states and federal government respectively. Fifth Amendment applying to the federal government, 14th Amendment applying to the states. Now, it's important to recognize that in most cases when we talk about due process, we're talking about a procedural thing. So that we have to make sure that procedures are fair and that the procedures are accessible to everyone, and that the government, when they do take these rights or limit your rights, provide you a method by which to redress those grievances. So let me give you an example of due process in terms of like a criminal trial. So procedural due process requires that someone accused by the government of a crime be provided with a fair and impartial jury before the liberty can be taken away, i.e. thrown in jail. And if that process is fair, then procedural due process has been satisfied, and the government absolutely can take away your liberty interests in that regard. Substantive due process is significantly different, and it's more than simply fair procedures. It applies that the Due Process Clause deals with something substantive, and we should juxtapose our understanding of procedural with substantive. Procedural says that the process is fair. Substance requires that we're dealing with something much more holistic. Substantive due process is a guarantee that no person shall be arbitrarily, unreasonably deprived of their liberty interests. Black's Law Dictionary defines it as broadly defined as a constitutional guarantee that no person shall be arbitrarily deprived of his life, liberty, or property. The essence of substantive due process is the protection from arbitrary and unreasonable action. So this is kind of a broader definition than procedural due process that deals with almost primarily the fairness of the process involved in removing someone's liberty interests. Substantive due process is more holistic. And so substantive due process means that there exists substantive protection over some rights, i.e. in general, privacy is a really good example. In an early Supreme Court case, Calder v. Bull in 1798, they argued that there are certain vital principles in our free and republican government, and we will determine and overrule an apparent and flagrant abuse of legislative power. What this means is that there might be substantive rights of individuals which neither the federal government nor the state legislatures can impede when general principles of justice exist. And so, in essence, what substantive due process harkens to is this idea that there exists a fundamental right to this thing, privacy. Another good example is marriage, that there exists a substantive nature to it. And what substantive due process says is that this is an inherent existing right, and that either the federal government or the state legislatures can absolutely not infringe upon it. It's sort of the Ninth Amendment in play. So all rights, this is an exhaustive listing of rights in essence. But what substantive due process does is it allows judges to read into the Constitution rights that aren't there. Since there is no overall guiding principle about what rights should be included via substantive due process, what this means is ideologically predisposed judges and courts can read rights into the Constitution that probably shouldn't be there. And we'll see how that plays out today in this section. So to give you an example of how substance due process came into existence, um, I want you to first think about the last class that we did, and where we talked about certain rights being fundamental. So life, liberty, and property automatically go in there. But remember the ones we talked about last class: marriage, procreation, privacy, and the home. These are explicitly not within the Constitution, but they were read into the Constitution via substantive due process. There existed one fundamental right that exists before marriage, procreation, and privacy are read into the Constitution that has absolutely fallen out of fashion. And that right that was read into the Constitution via substantive due process was known as liberty of contract. Liberty of contract was a conceptualization of largely the late 1800s, 1890s, through the early 1900s, and it also got a significant amount of um, hold in the Supreme Courts of those time, where they read this liberty of contract into the Constitution. What that, in essence, meant for any state or federal government that was attempting to regulate in this area is it provided a constitutional protection that any state-based or federal-based restriction between an employer and employee was inherently unconstitutional. And so this liberty of contract, where the sort of modern substantive due process comes into existence, modern being early 1900s, the method by which it was read into the Constitution, substantive due process, became unpopular. Because it largely got seen by the legal community as a whole as a method by which unrepresentative judges could read something into the Constitution that prevented any sort of legislation, even though that protection is nowhere textually within the Constitution. Now, liberty of contract proved to be unpopular, but protections against an inherent fundamental right towards marriage, a fundamental right of procreation, and a fundamental right of privacy in one's home, those aren't unpopular. But we need to recognize that the method by which they've been read into the Constitution is the same, and that's via substantive due process. So substantive due process as a mechanism for reading fundamental rights into the Constitution became exceedingly unpopular. And that's because the liberty of contract provided for unfettered laissez-faire capitalism within the United States, which became an exceedingly untenable position to hold when you're going through a depression. And so the actual mechanism also became unpopular. Not just liberty of contract, but the mechanism of substantive due process fell out of fashion among legal academics. And it took a fair degree of time for it to become back in vogue. And it's still not entirely popular among legal circles because it does allow judges to read rights into the Constitution that aren't there and that may prove to be unpopular among large swaths of American society.